You can turn your Bibles to Exodus chapter 13. We're going to start in verse 17. And we're going to read not only Exodus 13, 17 through the end of that, but we're also going to read most of chapter 14. We're going to do a lot of reading today. We are in week 3 of a sermon series that we're calling The Greatest Story Forever Told, where we are looking at some of the great stories in the Bible in order to truly embrace the story of the Bible. Today, we're going to read and study the story of God's people crossing the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, and the Egyptians being swept away in the background. This is one of the most famous stories in all of the Bible. It's a story about God's power. It's a story about God gaining glory for himself. It's a story about God as Redeemer, but it also speaks to a really specific area of our lives. See, this story also tells us what it takes to be free. It talks about what it means for us to make progress, and it talks about this idea, it speaks of this idea of the temptation that all of us have to be paralyzed by fear as we are moving in the direction that God has initiated for us. It speaks about our nature, and as it relates to God's plan and the sort of the crushing in of the world. It speaks of the idea of us doubting where we're going next, but realizing that we have a God that brings it all the way to the end. It's a wonderful story, and it teaches us that freedom isn't free, that progress is paid through effort and faithfulness and through the miracles of a really gracious, gracious God. We're going to start reading in just a moment in Genesis chapter 13, verse 17, but I want to make a quick note before we look at it. We're going to look into this passage, and we're going to learn some things about ourselves, but we have to be careful when we look at biblical narratives, because we have to remember that we are not at the center of this story. So before I read about how God, drowned the Pharaoh and then split the sea, I want to make sure that we don't think that every trial we go through is like a Red Sea. Like you just got a headache. That's just my Red Sea today, or whatever. I have to pay $2,000 in taxes. My Red Sea, like that. That's not the way this works. Or we could take the Bible to some illogical extremes. We can be like, Pharaoh is my boss. God, drown him. He's my mother-in-law. Drown him. So the thought. So instead of all that, we're not going to try to piece together this whole story. We're going to look at one really specific application about what it takes for us to be called out of a life of sin and despair, insecurity and longing, and into the full life that God has ordained for us to have. We're going to look again, beginning Exodus chapter 13, verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go. Last time we left off in our story, we were with a man named Abraham. But now, all of a sudden, there are a bunch of these Abraham's descendants living in Egypt. And so how did we get there? I'm going to save us about 50 hours of reading and give you a little bit of a recap. We just watched, last time we were here together, we watched Abraham tested at Mount Moriah, tested to sacrifice his son Isaac. And we learned that we don't always know the outcome, but faith can sometimes feel unbearable. That we shouldn't trivialize the challenges we go through. Instead, we should hold on to the truth of the story and realize that God has a lesson and also God has a way out. As we ended last week, we saw that God once more decided that, I'm going to bless you again, Abraham, because you have been faithful. And so God does exactly for Abraham what he promised to do for Abraham. God allows Isaac to grow up and become a great man after God's own heart. He has 2 sons, and for the sake of our discussion, we'll talk about one of the sons, a son named Jacob. Jacob is like his father Isaac and like his father Abraham. God shows him favor. God blesses him. As a matter of fact, in Genesis chapter 32, you can read the story on your own. There's a fascinating account where God confronts Jacob, and Jacob wrestles with God all night long. And at the end of the wrestling, Jacob prevails and God blesses him. And God blesses him by changing his name, and changes his name to Israel, which means wrestles with God or struggles with God. And that little thought, this idea that God struggled with Jacob and that God wrestles with his people becomes a really common thought throughout the entirety of the scriptures, as we see men and women who are called by God really wrestling with God in great ways. Israel grows up and he has 12 sons who later become the 12 tribes of Israel. His youngest son is named, or one of his youngest sons is named Joseph, and you can find that story at the very end of the book of Genesis. Joseph is sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. And eventually, God elevates him to the position of prime minister, where he saves his whole family. the very family who sold him into slavery. He saves all of them from a famine. It's a really beautiful story. You should read it sometime. It's wonderful. That's the story that ends the book of Genesis. All of a sudden, God's people are living in Egypt. And at the end of the book of Genesis, you see, okay, it looks like it's all good. But then you turn over your page to the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 1, and you see this picture unfolding. This is what it says. It says, now Joseph and all of his brothers and all the generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. God promised this, didn't he? They multiplied greatly, increased in number, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to the people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. So we fast forward a lot of centuries and a lot of stories, and the history of God's plan is unfolding. The promise that he made from Abraham is unfolding. But now it looks like they're in a little bit of a head, because all of God's people are now stuck in slavery. But God hears the cries of those who are enslaved. So God comes to their rescue. He calls on a man named Moses to be their deliverer. Course of events when God shows his incredible power and his majesty. Here in Exodus chapter 13, Moses now has all the people out of Egypt, and they're headed on the road towards freedom. I'm tired. But even with this, there is a new struggle before them. There was a struggle being enslaved in Egypt, but now there's a new struggle, and the struggle has a lot to do with their freedom. They never expected it. And I want to just let you know today, this message is for all of us who have been saved from something. Saved from our sins, saved from some captivity in Egypt, kind of figuratively speaking, saved from the life that we once lived, and now we're on the road, on the way. This is a message for anybody who's on the way to overcoming, maybe to a new level of faithfulness, maybe to a dream that you want to finally fulfill with your relationship with God, a vision that you have in your life, to be finally freed from maybe a sin in your life, or to overcome a challenge that has been persistent in your life for such a long time. This lesson is for people who are on their way but feeling discouraged as you go. And as we talk today, I want to talk to three different distinctive groups, and maybe you can find yourself in each of the three groups, but we're going to look together and see if we can find ourselves in it and see the one practical that God has for all three groups. Exodus 13, verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though it was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them around the desert road towards the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. So here it is. God has freed his people from slavery. They're on the road, and all of a sudden there's a shorter path that they can go, but God goes, no, I'm not going to bring you down the shorter path. Instead, I'm going to bring you maybe a longer way. And so the first group I want to talk to today are those of you who feel like you're on their way, but maybe God has been telling you you're not ready. You're on your way, but you're not ready. See, God knows his people. They've been slaves for close to 400 years, and they had no idea what it actually took to be free. They didn't know what it meant to fight for something. They didn't know what it meant to really have to get grit and dirty in sort of a war. And so God says, you don't really know how to fight, and so I'm going to lead you the long way, a very indirect way to the place that you're going, because you're not ready for battle, even though you think you are. How many of us have found ourselves in that position before? God, I am ready. I'm ready. God, I'm ready to take on this new challenge. I'm ready to take on this new relationship. I'm ready to take on this new job. I'm ready to take on this new vision for my life. I'm ready to take it on. And God's like, no. You are not ready. I want to show you the indirect way in which they went. Can you just go to the second picture? So So this is a hand-drawn thing because I lost my clicker. So that's the start. That's around where they start. You see all that green up there? That's Egypt. It's really luscious and beautiful there. Do you see all the tan? That's the desert. People die in the desert. And so God was trying to send them west, so directly that direction, right? But he goes, you know what? You can't march through those Philistine countries. So I'm going to bring you directly south, a way that you don't really want to go. How many times in your life have you gone, God, this is not where I thought my life would be? I thought I was ready. I came out ready for battle. I dressed in all the right clothes. I was looking for war. But God goes, you can't go into war, because if you go into this particular war, you're going to quit. You're going to quit. God keeps some things from us because he knows that we're not ready for it. He knows that we're not ready for it. And the quickest way isn't always the best way. You may need to mature a little bit. So if you're discouraged today, you feel like, man, God sent me to a new life. I was so excited, but I haven't really gotten through the thing that I wanted to get through. Maybe the whole point is that you're really not ready yet. You're not ready. You don't know how to be free yet. I thank God that we serve a master who knows when we're ready and takes us into a different route if he feels like we're not. Because here's the thing, and all of us know this, defeat will bring tremendous discouragement. God brings you into a battle you're not ready for, and you get destroyed by it. You're going to be horribly discouraged. So God protects us. Maybe you aren't really ready for that boyfriend. Maybe you aren't really ready for that new job. Maybe you aren't really ready for it. And so God's just preparing you. He's preparing you. And sometimes, you get exactly what you looked for, but other times you don't really get it. Maybe he didn't give it to you because he knew that it would break you. And I heard this one time said by a preacher. I love it. It says, you'll get what you want, but you won't want what you get when you get it. So maybe, God, please, Lord, send me this boyfriend. And then God gives you the person, you're like, oh no, I never wanted it. Please, take it away, Lord. Please. There's this feeling. And so anyway, God is leading his people in a different direction because he knows what's best for them. He knows what's right for them. He knows what they actually need. He knows they need to learn to trust him. He knows they need to learn something about God's power and his majesty. God's way isn't always the most obvious way. It's not always the fastest way or the quickest way to get the results that you are in hoping to get to. But the best thing about God is that God's ways are always the best way. And Moses has an application, and God has an application for you, and it's going to come a little bit later. We'll skip to chapter 14, beginning of verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near PH, I don't know how to pronounce that, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposed to Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering because the land, around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. Because, again, they're headed the wrong way. And so if you look at the map one more time, you're going to see, where is there to go? You have a sea on your left. You have a desert to your south. To your east is back to Egypt. To your north is back to Egypt. Where are they to go? Where are they to go? So God's saying this is part of the plan. The story is unfolding, and this is part of the plan. The wandering is part of the plan. Verse 4. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, but I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his armies, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and all his officials changed their mind, which he does over and over and over again, about them, and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and lost their services. Egypt is upset now because they've lost about 1 million of their manual laborers. And so they go, what have we done? We got to go get them back. And I think this is so cool because what's about to unfold here is something that I think really resonates in our life. God's allowing their journey to be used as an illustration for his power. Their journey to be used as an illustration for his glory. So Pharaoh sees these people camping there and he goes, there's no way they can get out of this mess. I'm going to pursue them. Verse 6. So he had his chariots made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officials over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Israelites were marching out boldly, and now all of a sudden, the most powerful army in the known world is coming after them. 600 chariots strong, the most powerful force. They're marching on to people who are freed slaves who have no idea how to fight. It's like if you States Army. The army got airplane, like a bunch of ragtag crew with a couple of swords. They are being chased down. Verse 9. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near PH opposite Baal Zephon. When the Bible says the Egyptians overtook the Israelites, it doesn't mean that they gained a little ground on them. It doesn't mean that, it's okay, we'll stand up and turn around and fight. It means impending doom. They are coming. Immediate death. They are thundering forward. It must have sounded like 100 trains. The smoke and the sand and the cloud of dust billowing in the background. And they look up and they go, oh no. Oh no. This is death. This is the grim reaper coming at you. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "What was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us into the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us up out of Egypt?" It's interesting, right, that the same people who are crying to get out are now crying to go back. They were marching out ready for battle, prepared. And God's like, you're not ready for that battle. You're certainly not ready for this battle. And here's another thing I see really that's kind of profound here. These people are asking this question. Look, I came out of Egypt. I came out of slavery. I broke those cycles, that old me, I broke it out. And now it looks like on the outside, there's much more harm than on the inside. Oh, overwhelmed. I want to talk to a second group of people who are on their way, but you're overwhelmed. There's a time in the process of God leading you out of your life of sin and rebellion into a perfect life, into a purpose-filled life, when there comes a time when you want change and you want progress and you want to overcome and you want something new and you want to be great and maybe you want the new adventure or the new challenges. You want the process. You want to see a vision for your life and a dream and a plan. In the midst of all of that, there are times when you look up and maybe even you look up at the things you left and all of a sudden they're closing in on you. I thought I left that. I thought I gave up that thing, and now the sin is creeping back in my life. I thought I was free from that stuff, and now it's coming back. Not only is it coming at me, but man, I am overwhelmed by what's before me. All I could see is a sea before me, and behind me an army that wants to destroy me. I'm stuck. You know what? I'm just going to settle out here. I'll just settle out here. I'll settle in the desert. I've given a lot. I don't want to give anymore. I'll settle on the banks of the Red Sea. That's enough for me. I've changed enough. I've sacrificed enough. Maybe the vision I had for my life was a little too grandiose. I connected a little bit to the brothers or to the sisters. I had a dream about what it meant to become a disciple, but now they're challenging me on things I never wanted to change. I'll just settle in right here. I'm on my way, but I'm overwhelmed. See, there is a sense. It's actually easier to live in the predictability of spiritual slavery than the uncertainty of freedom. There's a sense, right, where it's just easier to be in the world, living however you wanted to live, because you don't have anything to look over you. You don't have any guidance. You don't have anything. You don't have to put up with anybody, at least so it seems. It seems like there's an immense freedom in spiritual slavery. And in fact, the thing that you're trying to be free from is the thing that ends up enslaving you. And here it is. You just, freedom means you can't settle, right? Freedom means you can't just settle down here. You got to get to the place that God has called you to. Freedom means you might be overwhelmed. Freedom means that you're going to have to change your schedule. You're going to have to step out on faith a little bit. Freedom means you're going to have to sacrifice more than you've ever sacrificed before. And sometimes you look at it and you go, you know what? Slavery, spiritual slavery was a little bit better than that. There's a feeling of being overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. I've stepped out on faith so much, I don't know if I can step out again. I've stepped out of my comfort zone. I don't know if I can step out again. I don't know if I can share my faith again. I don't know if I can get people in my life again. It's really easy, isn't it, to be overwhelmed when you have a vision for your life and that vision comes into contact with what it takes to get there. And there's another group. So there's the first group who's feeling like, you know what, I'm ready. And God's like, you're not ready. Then there's a second group who's like, I'm on my way, but I'm overwhelmed by what it takes to be free. And there's a third group, and we're going to read that right here in verse 12. It says, this is the Israelites. They're speaking. Didn't we say to you in Egypt, they're talking to Moses, leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. What are they saying? Look, I just want to go back. There's a third group of people who are on their way, but they're doubting. You're doubting if you made the right decision to even be free in the first place. You're doubting. You look, this is looking some of you right in the mirror. You're like, man, that's kind of me. You're thinking maybe my life would have been better off if I didn't have God's intervention in every area. Maybe my life would have been better off if I didn't have God as my matchmaker. Because it's getting late for me. I see everybody else's invitations going out, save the dates or whatever. And here I am, I'm trying to serve you. My best friend's sleeping with her boyfriend. I'm trying to be pure, and look where that's left me. I think it would be better off if God wasn't my business partner. Man, I can't tell the lies to make that sale that everybody else does. Maybe it would be better if God wasn't my marriage counselor. And I could say whatever I wanted to say because I feel like I'm being taken advantage by him or taken advantage by her. Maybe it would just been better to be back in Egypt. You know, they're talking to Moses, but really they're questioning God. They're asking the question, would it actually be better without God? Would my life be better without him? And I'm sure some of you have been there before. We have questioned, God, I don't know. This is a little intense. When I left Egypt, when I left my life of sin, when I left it all behind, God was promising me a new life. Tony, you said a life to the full, and it hasn't been all that full yet. I think some days it'd just be better if I didn't forgive my enemies. If I didn't turn the other cheek, maybe people would treat me better. If God didn't have to have an influence on my money, or my marriage, or my relationships, or my time. They're doubting. So maybe that's you. Maybe you're the person that's not ready. Or you think you are, but you're not ready. Maybe you're the person that's on the journey, but you're overwhelmed by what it takes to be free. Or maybe you're the person who's on your way, but you're just doubting. You're doubting whether or not it's the right path in general. And so this is where Moses is. He's talking to a crowd about 1 million strong of people who are in all different walks of life. But so the people are crying out. They're crying out to Moses and they're crying out to God. And God is about to do something extraordinary. He's about to do something that the known world has never seen before. This is a miracle on top of a miracle. This is one of the coolest miracles in all of the Bible. But before God does it, Moses has something to say to the crowd. And I love this verse. It's some simple advice. Simple advice. And this is what it says. It's powerful, though. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." Verse 14, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Love that. God's going to fight for you. It's powerful. It's encouraging, right? Okay, you're not ready. God's going to fight for you. You're overwhelmed. God's going to fight for you. You're doubting. God is going to fight for you. You need only be still. This is amazing. This is powerful. The problem is it's actually sort of incomplete. And I missed these for so many years. I missed this passage for so many years because Moses gives this opinion and then God gives a counter opinion. I love this. Sorry. God is going to fight for you. You need only be still. Verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Did you ever read this in your whole life? Isn't this hilarious? The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Why are you talking to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. This is a different opinion. You need only be still. God says, don't just be still. Move on. Tell the people to move on. But they're not ready. Tell them to get prepared. Oh, but they're overwhelmed. Tell them to trust me. Oh, okay, but they're doubting. Teach them to be overcomers. It's time to take some personal responsibility for your own life. Tell them to move on. You can't just stay here. You can't sit idly by. But wait, I'm not really ready yet. You got to move. But wait, no, I'm not sure. You have to move, or you can just stay there and get destroyed. It's totally up to you. You got to move forward. Keep going. That's the command. Keep going. And this is the point. Look, your freedom, my freedom, the areas of my life where I want to improve in my spirituality, the things I'm looking forward to, even the relationships I want to improve, my relationship with God, how often I want to pray or how often I want to read, how I want to restore maybe a relationship with my father or my family or whatever it is. You know, all that stuff. You can't just stay still and go, God, will you please change me? God's like, you got to move on. You got to do something. There's a level of responsibility that's often overlooked in the Christian world. You are part of the plan. You are part of it. And so you got to do something. You can't be like, God, you know what? If you just made everything better, it'd be really great. God's like, why don't you make things better? Why are you crying out to me? God, I would love to overcome my addiction to pornography. God's like, have you put a blocker up? I would love to have a better relationship with my wife. Have you ever apologized? God, will you please change this? Will you please change my work dynamic? It's really difficult. Have you ever learned to be respectful of your boss? Move on. Move on. God's like, why are you crying out to me? And it reminds me of the passage in John chapter 8 where Jesus is speaking. Hold to my teachings, abide in my teachings. That's what that means. You are really my disciple. Up all these different asterisks. Freedom is the goal. But to get freedom, you have to know the truth. And to know the truth, you have to abide in the teachings. You have to live in them. Truth comes by way of action. Freedom comes by way of action. And I noticed that we have a tendency to stand still when we ought to be moving on. Did you know that it's possible for you to be on the right path, but if you don't move, it's possible for you to still be run over? God is simply asking, and actually He's empowering you to do your part. God wants us to learn to do what we're called to do, to live out the Scriptures. Not to just come here expecting God to change your whole life and then send you back out there. No, you become a different person. You become a different person because of the work in which you do. Sometimes we just stand here until I figure it all out. I'm going to sit here, and when I figure it all out, that's when I'll move forward. You got to keep going. You got to move forward. And I made the decision in my life that I would rather be headed towards freedom and uncertain about the future than be stuck in slavery, even with the predictability that it all brings. And here's the thing. God is about to do something amazing. When we do our part, God does His part. And His part is way bigger than your part. God is about to do something actually unbelievable. It's a miracle of epic proportion. It's one of the greatest miracles in all of the Bible. But before He does it, He just implores and He implants this thought. You got to be a part of it. God is going to do something amazing to end your story. But you're a part of your story too. So here's the point. Galatians chapter 5, Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, it says this. It's for freedom that Christ has set you free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourself be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. And I love this passage as kind of a continuing illustration of what we're talking about. Because the Apostle Paul is letting us know that freedom is actually a process. It is for freedom that you have been set free. You set free and then you work towards freedom. So it takes some effort. And the Apostle Paul is letting us know it's very easy to be yoked again into the bondage of slavery, spiritual slavery, when God has allowed you to be set free. Being free is hard. It takes work. And so Moses encourages the group, and here's the climax of the story. I love this. Verse 16. God says to Moses, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea. And this is so strange. Like, imagine you didn't know the end of the story. Here are the Egyptians. They're coming at you with all the force any army could muster in all of the world. 600 chariots thundering towards you. And God tells you to lift up a stick. You know, like think of how crazy this is. Like, Moses is there, and he's like picking up this stick. And we always like, wow, Moses, you're so brave. Moses is like, God, would you please help me out? Like, please, Lord, back me up. And it says, divide the waters so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And this is so powerful. I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his armies, through his chariots and his horsemen. The journey you're on, the journey that you and I are on, will end, if we decide to move forward in faith, will end with God gaining glory for himself. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of the Israelite army, withdrew and went behind them. I love that. He was going in front of them, leading them, and now it's going behind them to protect them. And we're gonna skip down a little bit to verse 21. It says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all the Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked up from the pillar of fire and the cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots, so they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Isn't it crazy that at the start of this story, the story started with God's people trying to get away from their enemy, and it ends with God's enemies trying to get away from God's people. Verse 26, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea of the waters. The waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The Lord flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen and the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. You got to keep going. You got to move forward. You got to get through, and God is going to do his part. Your part is to walk. God is going to split a sea. What he's doing is far bigger than whatever you're doing. Because this is a story, and our lives are the story of God's glory. We've talked about lots of different topics, but this is a story about God bringing glory to himself. About God going, look, I'm going to use your life to make my name famous. God is working to restore men and women. God is working so that we will trust him, but we got to trust the process. We got to trust if we're not ready that God knows when we're ready. We got to trust that if we're overwhelmed, God is going to bring us from that season into a brand new season. And if we're doubting, we have to trust God's word again, that he is going to bring about all that which he promised. If you're feeling discouraged, if you're feeling broken, if you're feeling kind of afraid about where your life is headed, I just want to encourage you one more time. God is going to do something amazing, but you got to do your part. You got to move into the middle of the sea if you want to see the miracle. Get out of your comfort zone. You can't stay where you are, because if you stay where you are, you're going to be devoured by the armies that are coming. I'm going to finish the story, verse 29. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground. with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hand of the Egyptian, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Verse 31, and when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. You might be fighting some battles today. You might feel like you lost some skirmishes, but I promise you, God has already won the war. God is sending winds. God is sending powerful forces that we don't even all understand. We don't know how he's going to do it, but man, can we trust him and be faithful in the little things? So at the end, we can see the great power of God. Next week, we're going to look at Joshua in the Battle of Jericho. Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Please like, comment, and subscribe. We're so excited about all that God is doing right here in Broward County, Florida.